Late evening at Graceland. The cicadas hum outside. A soft strum of guitar drifts from another room, and somewhere in the distance, the guards laugh quietly among themselves. The house, though full of people, feels strangely hushed, as if holding its breath. In later years, Lisa Marie would recall that night as one of the most unforgettable of her childhood. Not because of the cameras outside the gates, not because of the endless strangers who worshipped her father, but because of a secret she dared to share. She was not afraid of the fans. She was not afraid of the flashing lights or the constant noise that surrounded her life. What frightened her more than anything was what her father might say. That evening, with her heart pounding in her chest, she finally spoke the words that had been building inside her. For the first time, she looked at the man the world called a king and whispered, "Daddy, I like a boy." The silence that followed cut through the room like a knife, and the answer Elvis gave his daughter that night, quiet, unexpected, unforgettable, would leave a deeper mark on her than any stadium full of applause. Because in that fragile moment, the legend disappeared, and only a father remained. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. The gates of Graceland were never truly quiet. Day and night, cars would slow down, tourists would gather, and voices carried from the road. "Is he home? Elvis! Elvis!" For the world, it was a palace. White columns, wrought iron gates, endless myth. For Lisa Marie, it was simply the house where she grew up. A house that felt less like a home and more like a stage where the lights never dimmed. From her earliest memories, there were always strangers just beyond the iron gates. Fans pressed notes through the bars, shouting promises of eternal love. She saw the faces of women with tears streaming down their cheeks when her father's car rolled past, and she wondered, even as a little girl, why people cried for someone they didn't know. At night, while others dreamt in silence, she sometimes woke to the muffled hum of cars parked outside, headlights sweeping across her bedroom wall as people tried to catch a glimpse of the king. The grandeur was undeniable. Rooms lined with velvet curtains, chandeliers that scattered light in 1,000 directions, endless trays of food prepared by staff. She never wanted for anything material. Yet beneath the surface of all this abundance was a solitude she couldn't quite name as a child. There were always people around, bodyguards, assistants, cooks, cousins, but rarely the stillness of a family dinner, rarely the quiet security of normalcy. Her parents' voices, too often raised in the years before their separation, carried through the grand hallways. She remembered hiding at the top of the stairs, clutching the railing, listening to the sharp edge in her mother's tone and the weary resignation in her father's replies. For all the house's size, there was nowhere to escape the tension. When Elvis and Priscilla finally divorced in 1973, Lisa Marie was just 5. The world called it scandal. She only knew it as loss. One parent here, the other there. No matter which house she stayed in, something essential felt missing. She couldn't explain it then, but she began to sense that stability was a gift ordinary children received, and she did not. Even her friendships carried a hidden weight. When she tried to be just another girl at school, whispers trailed her in the hallways. "That's Elvis's daughter." Some children wanted to sit near her just to say they had. Others avoided her, assuming she lived in a universe they'd never touch. At birthday parties, she caught parents staring, gauging whether they might somehow gain an invitation to Graceland. She laughed when she was supposed to, joined in games, but there was always the question gnawing at her. Do they like me? Or do they like who I belong to? Trust became slippery. She guarded herself without realizing it, holding back parts of her world. The palace she lived in made her, in some strange way, untouchable to others her age. For a child, that isolation was sharper than luxury could ever dull. And yet, her father was her anchor. When Elvis was present, he gave himself completely. He was not the king to her in those moments, but simply Daddy, his laughter filling the room, his arms strong and protective, his voice soft when the world outside roared too loudly. He would kneel to her level, his hair still damp from stage lights, eyes lined with exhaustion, and listen to her chatter about dolls or playground drama as if nothing else mattered. He spoiled her with gifts, yes, but the truest gift was his attention. It was fleeting. He was gone so often, but when it was there, it burned brighter than anything else. It was around this time, as childhood tilted into the confusing territory of adolescence, that Lisa began to look differently at the boys around her. Not just as classmates or companions in schoolyard games, but as figures who stirred new, unnameable emotions. She caught herself glancing longer, wondering if her feelings were visible, fearing they might betray her. The paradox was cruel. Though she longed for connection, she was terrified of revealing herself. What if any affection she offered would be overshadowed by her last name? Would anyone ever see her, just Lisa, and not Elvis Presley's daughter? The contradiction shaped her days. At home, she lived in a gilded fortress, adored by strangers, shielded by guards. At school, she wrestled with self-doubt, wary of every smile, every whispered comment. Her father was idolized by millions, yet she, his only child, sometimes felt like the loneliest girl in Memphis. And so, in the midst of chandeliers and screaming fans, Lisa Marie Presley began to discover the most human of truths. That no amount of grandeur could soften the ache of solitude, that trust was more valuable than riches, and that love, real love, was the one thing she was not certain she could ever recognize, if it appeared. School was supposed to be the one place where Lisa could feel normal. Yet even the classrooms and hallways seemed to echo her father's name. Teachers smiled at her differently, cautious in their discipline. Classmates' parents whispered during pickup, their eyes widening at the thought that Elvis Presley's daughter sat among their children. For Lisa, it was exhausting. She wanted badly to be invisible, just another girl who could giggle at jokes and whisper secrets without wondering what the motive behind a smile was. But the Presley name clung to her like a second skin. One afternoon, walking past a knot of girls near the lockers, she caught the sharp sting of laughter that wasn't meant for her ears. "Imagine trying to have a boyfriend with Elvis as your dad," one of them whispered, not quietly enough. "He'd never let her date anyone. He'd scare them all away." Another chimed in, "Who'd even dare? He's Elvis." The laughter that followed was thin and cruel. Lisa kept walking, her stomach twisting. She'd grown used to whispers, but this cut deeper. For the first time, she realized the shadow of her father's fame wasn't only outside the gates of Graceland. It followed her into the fragile, secret territory of her own heart. Because there was a boy. Nothing dramatic, just a classmate whose crooked smile lingered in her mind after school, whose voice she recognized instantly in the blur of the cafeteria. She'd never told a soul. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was the beginning of something. New, fragile, frightening. And now, with those mocking voices in her head, the thought of telling her father felt impossible. Elvis was not just a parent, he was a legend. What if he laughed at her? What if he forbid it? What if he thought she was too young, too foolish? The weight of that unspoken fear grew heavier with every passing day. That evening, back at Graceland, the house hummed with its usual rhythm. Guards moved in and out, telephones rang with constant urgency. Someone was always coming to or leaving from the kitchen. Lisa sat on the staircase, knees drawn up, listening to the low murmur of voices in the living room. Her father was there, guitar in hand, softly strumming as if he were alone. He often did this, played not for an audience, but for himself, working through melodies that never reached the stage. She lingered at the edge of the room, shifting her weight from foot to foot. He noticed. Without looking up, he said quietly, "Come on in, little girl. Don't just hover there." Lisa stepped forward, heart racing. He sat slouched in an armchair, hair falling across his forehead, the guitar resting casually against his chest. His presence filled the space, not with grandeur, but with warmth that made the air feel safer. Still, she hesitated. The words caught in her throat. She tried to ask about school, about her mother, anything to delay the moment. He looked at her more closely now, setting the guitar aside. "Something's on your mind," he said gently. "What is it?" Her pulse pounded. For a second, she considered retreating, inventing a story about homework. But then, the memory of those girls at school came rushing back, their cruel laughter needling her. And before she could stop herself, the words tumbled out. "Daddy, I like a boy." The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. The hum of the air conditioner, the distant sound of traffic outside, even the ticking of the ornate clock on the mantel, everything grew louder against the absence of his reply. She stared at the floor, cheeks burning, bracing for laughter, for disappointment, for a sharp reminder that she was too young. Every possibility swirled in her mind, none of them comforting. When she finally dared to look up, Elvis wasn't smiling. He wasn't frowning either. His expression was unreadable, his gaze steady, almost searching. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, studying his daughter with an intensity that froze her breath in her chest. He said nothing at first, and the quiet was its own kind of weight. For Lisa, the pause felt decisive, as if everything depended on what he would say next. It was the first time she realized how deeply her father's opinion could define her sense of self, how much her fragile courage rested in the hands of the man the world called a king, but she only knew as Dad. Her throat tightened. The room seemed smaller, the air heavier. She waited, caught between hope and dread. And in that unbearable stillness, the foundation of a memory she would carry for the rest of her life began to take shape. The silence that hung in the room after Lisa's confession was unlike any she had known before. Her father leaned back slowly, eyes narrowing not in anger but in contemplation. The weight of his gaze was heavy, and yet it carried no judgment. Finally, Elvis spoke, his voice low, steady. "So," he said, almost as if he were testing the word, "you like a boy." Lisa's hands twisted in her lap. She nodded once, bracing for laughter or a stern warning. But there was no hint of mockery in his tone. He didn't tease her, didn't tell her she was too young, didn't brush it aside. Instead, he leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, giving her his full attention. "Tell me about him," he said. "What's he like? Why do you like him?" The questions startled her. She had expected resistance, maybe even anger. Instead, he sounded curious, as if he truly wanted to understand. She stumbled over her words, describing the boy in small fragments, how he made her laugh, how he was kind in ways others didn't always notice. She didn't dare look directly at her father, afraid she might see disappointment. But Elvis only listened, nodding slowly. When she trailed off, he let the quiet settle for a moment before speaking again. You know, baby, the important thing isn't how funny he is, or how he looks, or even how much he likes you. His eyes fixed on hers now, piercing yet gentle. The important thing is how he treats you. Respect, that's the word. If he doesn't give you that, he's not worth a second of your time. You hear me? Lisa swallowed hard, her chest tightening. She nodded again, though she barely trusted her voice to answer. And one more thing, Elvis continued. You always have the right to say no. Don't let anyone make you feel like you don't. Not a boy, not a friend, not anyone. You belong to yourself before you belong to anybody else. The words landed with a gravity she hadn't expected. At school, the subject of boys was wrapped in jokes and giggles. Here, with her father, it became something sacred, something tied to her sense of worth. Then, unexpectedly, Elvis leaned back in his chair and looked past her, as if gazing into another time. His expression softened into something far away. You know, he said slowly, when I was your age, I didn't think anyone would ever look at me twice. I was skinny as a rail, poor as dirt. Your grandma did her best, but we had near nothing. My first crush, well, she liked somebody else. A boy with money, nice clothes. I thought that was the end of the world. Lisa blinked. She had never imagined her father as anything but dazzling. His face on billboards, his voice pouring from radios, women screaming his name. The idea of him being ignored, of him feeling small and invisible, shook her. He smiled faintly, though the memory still seemed to carry pain. I learned something then. It doesn't matter where you come from, or what you look like, or how the world sees you. What matters is finding someone who sees you, the real you, and treats you right. The room was quiet again, but this time the silence was warm, not heavy. Lisa felt her throat close, tears stinging at her eyes. She tried to hold them back, embarrassed, but they spilled anyway, hot and unbidden. Elvis didn't laugh, didn't tease her. He reached across the space between them and took her small hand in his, rough fingers folding gently around hers. Don't cry, darlin', he whispered. This isn't something to be afraid of. You came to me, and that means you trust me. That's all I could ever want. For the first time, Lisa felt the tightness in her chest loosen. The fear that had paralyzed her all day dissolved into something softer. She realized that her father wasn't a figure to be feared in this matter. He was her ally, her protector, someone who understood more than she had given him credit for. She leaned into him then, and he wrapped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. His heartbeat was steady beneath the fabric of his shirt, and for a moment she felt shielded from the entire world. That night, lying in bed, Lisa replayed every word. The warning about respect, the memory of his own heartbreak, the way his eyes softened when he told her she belonged to herself first. She realized that she hadn't just confessed a secret. She had received something priceless in return. A lesson, a compass, a promise that she could always turn to him, even in matters that frightened her most. It was not the answer she had feared, nor the dismissal she had expected. It was better. It was unforgettable, and it became the beginning of a truth she would carry for the rest of her life. That beneath the crown, beyond the blinding lights of fame, her father was first and always a man who wanted his daughter to grow up strong, unafraid, and cherished. The morning after their conversation, Lisa Marie woke with a strange mixture of relief and unease. She had finally trusted her father with something deeply private, and he hadn't mocked her or closed her off. He had listened. Yet as the day stretched forward, the outside world quickly reminded her that life as Elvis Presley's daughter was never simple. She stood by her window, looking down toward the gates of Graceland. Already, a crowd had gathered. Tourists pressed their faces against the iron bars, camera flashes puncturing the morning air. Some held signs, others tossed folded papers and flowers toward the guards. Lisa could hear their voices even from her room. Declarations of love, pleas for autographs, questions shouted as though her father were a mythic figure who might descend at any moment. For Lisa, it was jarring. Only last night, her father had been just daddy. Warm, human, fallible. This morning, the world reminded her he belonged to them as much as to her. And the contrast cut deep. Later that week at school, the gap between her private life and her father's public persona widened further. In the cafeteria, a boy her age smirked as she passed his table. "Why would anyone bother asking you out?" he said, loud enough for others to hear. "Your dad's Elvis. You don't live in the same world as the rest of us." Laughter rippled through the group. Lisa froze, her cheeks burning, then walked away as quickly as she could. His words weren't just cruel. They underlined the fear she had carried since the day she overheard the girls mocking her. The idea that she was untouchable, not because of who she was, but because of who her father was. That evening, her silence didn't escape Elvis's notice. He saw it in the way she pushed food around her plate, in her downcast eyes. He didn't press her with questions. Instead, the next morning, he surprised her. "Come on," he said, jangling his keys. "You're coming with me." The Cadillac rolled out of the driveway, the fans at the gates shrieking as usual. Lisa sat quietly in the passenger seat, unsure of their destination. When the car pulled up outside a recording studio downtown, she blinked in surprise. The studio was a world she rarely entered. Inside, the air was heavy with cigarette smoke and the faint tang of coffee gone stale. Wires coiled across the floor, microphones perched like sentries, reels of tape waiting to capture sound. Musicians shuffled, tuning instruments, their laughter sharp against the hum of amplifiers. Elvis guided her to a chair in the corner. "Sit. Watch." What she saw stunned her. On stage, her father was not the invincible man the world adored. He was restless, uncertain. He adjusted his guitar again and again, frowned at missed notes, sighed in frustration when the band stumbled. He rubbed his temples, muttered under his breath, even laughed awkwardly when he forgot a lyric. At one point, he stopped completely and turned to the group. "Let's try it again," he said, his voice quieter now, almost apologetic. It was the tone of someone who doubted. Someone human. Lisa's chest tightened. For the first time, she saw the cracks in the image that had always loomed so large. Elvis Presley, the man people screamed for, was in this room just another musician fighting to get it right. During a break, he wandered over to her, a towel draped around his neck. His face shone with sweat, and there was weariness in his eyes. Yet he smiled as he crouched down to her level. "See, even your daddy doesn't have it together all the time," he said with a wink. "Don't let anybody tell you different." Lisa studied him, her earlier humiliation at school still raw. He seemed to read her thoughts. His expression softened. "You're gonna hear people say you don't fit, that you don't belong, that your life's too different," he told her. "But don't you ever let that make you smaller. You're not above anyone, but you're not beneath them either. You're just you. And that's enough." The words sank into her like an anchor. For all the noise of the outside world, the gossip, the ridicule, the endless comparisons, here was the truth. Her father was not untouchable. He stumbled, he worried, he faltered. And in showing her that, He gave her permission to believe that she, too, could be enough, just as she was. That night, back at Graceland, Lisa replayed the scene in her mind. The sound of the band missing notes, the way her father pinched the bridge of his nose in frustration, the small but telling smile when he finally got it right. It was not the image on posters or the voice booming from radios. It was something greater, something far more intimate. She understood then that legends are made for the world, but fathers are made for their children. And Elvis Presley, her Elvis, was determined to be both. Summer in Memphis always carried a kind of restless energy, the air thick with heat, the sidewalks shimmering under the sun. For Lisa Marie, that summer was different. She had worked up the courage to tell her father about a boy, and now she wanted him to see the boy for himself. The decision wasn't made lightly. She'd rehearsed in her mind a dozen times how she'd bring it up, how she'd convince her father that this wasn't just another silly crush. Deep down, she wanted validation, not just for her feelings, but for the idea that someone might care about her simply for being Lisa, not for being Elvis's daughter. The boy lived just a few streets away, his family far from wealthy, their yard cluttered with bikes and tools rather than flower beds. He wasn't part of the glamorous Memphis crowd, didn't belong to any social circle chasing fame. To Lisa, that was what drew her in. He felt ordinary, untouched by the circus of her father's world. When Elvis first laid eyes on him, it wasn't during a formal introduction. One evening, as the Cadillac rolled slowly down the road near Graceland, Elvis spotted him with a group of friends. They were laughing, shoving each other in the careless way boys do. Then Elvis caught something, a sharp remark, a mocking tone, the boy leaning toward a girl and making her blush for the wrong reasons. The humor in his voice carried a hint of cruelty, the kind that left Elvis unsettled. Later, back at home, he sat with Lisa on the porch, the cicadas humming around them. He hesitated before speaking. "Baby," he said, his voice low, "are you sure this boy's got a good heart? Sometimes how a person treats others tells you more than how they treat you." Lisa stiffened instantly. To her, it sounded like doubt disguised as wisdom. She crossed her arms, her voice tight. "You don't even know him, Daddy. You just saw a moment. That doesn't mean anything." Elvis didn't raise his voice. He only studied her, that familiar mix of concern and patience etched into his face. But Lisa's defenses rose higher. For the first time in their relationship, she felt the sting of being misunderstood, of her father's protective instincts clashing with her own fragile independence. The tension lingered in the air. For days afterward, small silences opened between them, gaps where laughter usually lived. Lisa kept her distance, convinced that he simply didn't want her to grow up, that he would never see her as anything but the little girl trailing behind him in Graceland's endless hallways. But Elvis was not a man to push. One evening, when the house had finally grown quiet, and the bustle of staff and friends had retreated, he found her in her room. He didn't barge in or scold. He knocked lightly, waited, then stepped inside. His movements were slow, deliberate, as though he didn't want to startle her. "Lisa," he said, settling into the chair by her desk, "I know you think I'm just trying to keep you a child forever. But that's not it. I only want you to see people clearly. I've made mistakes, big ones, trusting folks who weren't what they seemed. It cost me more than I can tell you." She didn't answer right away, but the tension in her shoulders eased. He wasn't ordering her to give up the boy. He was opening a window into his own life. He went on, his voice softer now. "When I was coming up, I let people close who promised loyalty. Some of them turned around and used me, hurt me. Tried to take pieces of me I can never get back. I don't want that for you, darlin'. Not if I can help it." Lisa stared at him, torn. She wanted to argue, to insist that he was wrong about the boy. But his words carried weight, an honesty that came not from a legend's pedestal, but from scars he rarely showed. She realized, with a pang, that her father wasn't just guarding her youth. He was guarding her heart, trying to spare her from pain he himself had endured. Still, the conflict remained unresolved. Lisa clung to her hope, to the fragile belief that the boy was different, that her father's watchful eyes had misjudged him. And Elvis, though unconvinced, chose not to press further. He knew the line between guiding and controlling was thin, and crossing it might cost him the trust they had built. That night, as Lisa lay awake, she felt the first real crack between herself and her father. It wasn't anger. It was something more complicated. A collision of love, independence, and the inevitable march of growing up. And though neither of them said it aloud, both understood. This was the beginning of a new chapter in their relationship. One where trust would be tested, and where lessons could not always be taught. They would have to be lived. The summer evenings stretched long, heavy with the sound of insects and the scent of honeysuckle drifting through Memphis air. Lisa Marie tried to hold on to the fragile excitement she felt about the boy, clinging to it like a secret flame that could light her way through the shadows of loneliness. But secrets, once shared, had a way of slipping out into the world. It began innocently. A few whispered comments at school, little smiles exchanged between her classmates. Then the words grew bolder, sharper. "She's with him, you know," someone announced in the hallway, as though it were news fit for headlines. At first Lisa brushed it off, assuming it was nothing more than idle gossip. But soon she began to hear her own name paired with her father's, twisted into conversations she was never meant to overhear. And then came the cruelest truth. The boy himself was the one spreading it. She caught fragments of it one afternoon, hiding just out of sight near the lockers. His voice was loud, carrying the careless bravado of someone hungry for attention. "Yeah, that's right. Me and Lisa Presley, Elvis's daughter. Can you believe it?" His friends hooted, nudging him with admiration, their laughter echoing down the corridor. He basked in it, every word another spark of pride at being linked to her. Not because of who she was, but because of who her father was. The sting was immediate, a sharp fracture through her chest. She pressed herself against the cool brick wall, her heart hammering, her throat too tight to swallow. The one boy she had allowed herself to trust had turned her into a trophy, a story to brag about. In that instant, the tender illusion she had been guarding collapsed. That evening, Lisa retreated into silence. She ate little at dinner, excused herself early, and closed the door to her room. She couldn't bring herself to face her father. She was ashamed. Ashamed that she had ignored his caution. Ashamed that she had let herself be fooled. Ashamed that her longing to be seen had led her to someone who only wanted her name. But Graceland was never a place where secrets stayed hidden for long. The staff noticed her withdrawn demeanor. Whispers traveled faster than she imagined. It wasn't long before one of the security men, who had overheard boys joking outside a local store, brought the story to Elvis's attention. When he heard it, Elvis's chest tightened. He thought of Lisa's shining eyes the night she confessed her secret, of her fragile hope, and now of the weight she must be carrying alone. He paced the length of the room, torn. Should he confront her, expose what he knew? Or should he let her come to him in her own time? That night, He found her sitting cross-legged on her bed, the curtains drawn, the room dim except for the soft glow of a bedside lamp. She was staring at her hands, motionless. Elvis lowered himself onto the edge of the mattress, the silence between them thick. "Lisa," he said quietly, "I heard some things." Her head snapped up, eyes wide with panic, then dropped again, ashamed. She couldn't bring herself to meet his gaze. The tears came before she could stop them, slipping hot and silent down her cheeks. He didn't scold. He didn't say, "I told you so." Instead, he reached out, resting his large, calloused hand gently over hers. "Baby, look at me," he whispered. Slowly, reluctantly, she raised her eyes. His face was steady, his voice calm, though pain lingered in his expression. Not for himself, but for her. "I know it hurts," he said, "and I wish I could take that hurt away. But listen to me. It's not your fault. When somebody shows himself to be small, it doesn't make you smaller. It just means they weren't worthy of you." Lisa's sobs came harder now, raw and unguarded. Elvis pulled her into his arms, cradling her as though she were still little. He rocked her gently, the way he had when she was a child frightened by thunderstorms. His voice rumbled low against her ear, a kind of music in itself. "I've trusted people who turned out to be nothing but shadows," he continued. "They promised loyalty, friendship, love. But when it mattered, they were gone, or worse. I learned it the hard way, again and again. That doesn't make me weak, and it sure doesn't make you weak. It just means we cared enough to try." For Lisa, the words were both balm and burden. She wanted desperately to believe them, to let the shame fall away. Yet it clung stubbornly, whispering that she should have known better. But her father's embrace, steady and unwavering, began to soften the edges of that shame. In that moment, she realized something that would stay with her forever. Her father's strength was not in his fame, nor in the way he commanded a stage, but in his capacity to meet pain without bitterness, to acknowledge betrayal without letting it define him. Later, long after her tears had slowed and the house had grown quiet, Lisa lay awake replaying his words. She could still feel the warmth of his hand, hear the weight of his voice telling her she belonged to herself first. That respect was the measure of worth. It was the first heartbreak she had ever known, but also the first profound lesson her father had given her. That love without respect is an empty promise, and that even in the face of disappointment, she would never be alone. The days after the heartbreak were quiet ones at Graceland. Lisa Marie moved through the house like a shadow, polite but distant, her laughter muted, her gaze often lost somewhere beyond the ornate windows. She had learned her first sharp lesson about trust, and the sting had left her guarded. Where she once ran to her father with every secret, now she chose silence, afraid of exposing herself to more disappointment. Elvis noticed. He always did. He saw it in the way she avoided eye contact, in the way her footsteps were lighter, almost tentative, as though she were trying not to disturb anyone. It reminded him of himself at her age, when words had failed him, when he had carried wounds no one asked about. One evening, after the house had finally settled into stillness, Elvis walked down the hall toward Lisa's room. He paused at her door, hand resting against the frame. For a moment, he considered walking away, letting her keep her silence. But the thought of her carrying that hurt alone was too heavy. He knocked softly. "Come in," came her quiet reply. She was sitting on her bed, legs tucked beneath her, a book open but unread in her lap. She looked up as he entered, her face guarded. Elvis closed the door behind him and lowered himself into the chair across from her. For a while, neither spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, only tentative, as though both were waiting for the right words to appear. Finally, Elvis cleared his throat. "You know," he began, "I was thinking about when I was your age. Back in Tupelo, before anything changed." He leaned back, his gaze drifting somewhere far away. "There was a girl I thought the world of, pretty, smart. I worked up the nerve to tell her how I felt." Lisa tilted her head slightly, curiosity breaking through her shell of sadness. Her father rarely spoke about his life before the music, before the fame. "What happened?" she asked softly. He gave a small, rueful smile. "She told me I wasn't good enough. Said I didn't have money, didn't have nice clothes, didn't have anything worth offering. She liked another boy, the one with the shiny car and family money. And me? I walked home that night feeling about 2 inches tall." Lisa's eyes widened. The idea of her father, the man the entire world adored, being dismissed so cruelly seemed impossible. "But you're you," she said, almost incredulous. Elvis chuckled, shaking his head. "Back then, I was just a skinny kid with hand-me-down shoes and a voice no one cared about yet. To her, I was nothing. That kind of rejection cuts deep. You start to wonder if maybe they're right." His voice softened, almost a whisper. "But you learn. Love isn't always about getting what you want. Sometimes it's about realizing your worth even when others don't see it." For the first time since her heartbreak, Lisa let herself really look at him, not as the untouchable figure the world saw, but as a man who had carried his own wounds. She saw in his eyes a flicker of the boy he once was, walking home alone in the Mississippi night, carrying the same ache she now felt. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his voice steady. "That's why I tell you, baby, what matters isn't whether somebody likes you back. What matters is whether they treat you with kindness, whether they see you as someone worth protecting, not using. Respect is the difference between love and imitation." Lisa swallowed hard, her throat tight. The walls she had built around herself began to crack. The weight of his story, the rawness of it, reached a place her own pain couldn't touch. She realized that he wasn't speaking to her as a legend, or even as a parent issuing advice. He was speaking as someone who had been broken once, and who didn't want her to feel alone in that. Tears welled in her eyes again, though this time they weren't born of shame, but of recognition. She set the book aside and leaned forward, her small hand slipping into his. He closed his fingers around hers, the strength of his grip grounding her. For a long while, they simply sat like that. No lectures, no defenses, just father and daughter sharing the invisible scars of growing up. It was in that quiet, in that unplanned conversation, that a new bond was forged. Lisa understood now that her father's wisdom came not from the pedestal the world placed him on, but from the wounds he carried beneath it. And Elvis, seeing the shift in her eyes, knew that something had changed between them too. This was not the wide-eyed little girl he had once shielded from the world. This was his daughter stepping into her own strength, learning through pain, yet willing to let him walk beside her. That night, as the house settled into darkness, Lisa lay awake replaying his words. His story of rejection, his insistence on respect, his quiet confession that love was never guaranteed. It was a truth she had not wanted to hear, but one she now understood. And for the first time since the boy's betrayal, she didn't feel entirely broken. She felt connected to her father, to his past, to the invisible thread of resilience that bound them together. It was, she realized, a conversation that might never have happened if not for heartbreak. And yet, it was one she would carry with her long after the pain had faded. By the mid-1970s, the glow of Graceland's lights seemed softer to Lisa Marie, as though the house itself had begun to feel the weight of passing years. She was older now, more aware of whispers around her, whispers not about her own childhood struggles, but about her father's declining health. The people around Elvis did their best to hide it, masking concern with polite smiles. But children notice what adults hope they will not. Lisa saw the fatigue in his eyes when he came home from tours. She noticed how his steps were slower, how sometimes he sank into a chair with a heaviness that seemed far beyond his age. He was only in his early 40s, but the demands of the stage, the relentless adoration, the nights that stretched into dawn had all taken their toll. She overheard more than she should have. Murmurs in hallways, hushed conversations behind closed doors, words like doctor, medication, rest. Whenever she asked, her father would smile, brushing it off with a wave of his hand. "Don't you worry, little girl," he would say, his voice gentle, reassuring. "I'm fine, always fine." But Lisa could see past the mask. Children always do. One evening, the house was unusually quiet. The usual rhythm of laughter and voices seemed muted. Elvis sat at the piano in the music room, the lamps casting soft pools of light on the polished surface. Lisa lingered in the doorway, unnoticed at first, watching as his fingers moved slowly across the keys. The melody was unfamiliar, slower, more mournful than the songs he usually played at home. It carried a weight, a kind of sorrow that clung to each note. She stepped closer. "Daddy," she asked, her voice small, "why does it sound so sad?" Elvis paused, his hand still resting on the keys. For a moment, he seemed unsure of how to answer. Then, with a faint, tired smile, he said, "Because music always tells the truth, before we're ready to." Lisa didn't fully understand, but the words lodged in her heart, heavy and unshakable. She joined him on the bench, her small frame pressed against his side. He wrapped an arm around her shoulders and continued playing, the low chords vibrating through the room, filling the silence with something unspoken. The melancholy of that evening stayed with her. She began to sense that time was shifting, that something fragile hovered in the air. Even in moments of joy, rides on golf carts around the property, laughter during late-night snacks in the kitchen, there was a shadow that never fully left. Sometimes, when Elvis looked at her, she caught an expression she couldn't name, part pride, part sorrow, as though he were memorizing her face for a future he might not see. He still showered her with affection, still played the role of protector and confidant, but beneath the warmth was a quiet urgency, a need to leave her with words that would outlast him. Lisa felt it most on nights, when he sat with her before bed. He would tell stories from Tupelo, of dirt roads and borrowed guitars, of hunger and hope. She loved those stories, but lately his tone carried something different. Less nostalgia, more like instruction, as though he wanted her to learn from every hardship he had known, to arm her with truths she would need when he was gone. The world outside still saw the legend, the king who commanded stages with rhinestone-studded jumpsuits and thunderous applause. But Lisa saw the man who returned home afterward, shoulders slumped, eyes rimmed with exhaustion. She saw the way he sometimes lingered too long in silence, staring at nothing, lost in thoughts he never spoke aloud. She didn't yet have the words for what she was witnessing. All she knew was that the sense of safety she had always felt, the unshakable belief that her father was invincible, was beginning to erode. And though she clung to him more tightly than ever, deep down she sensed a truth children are rarely asked to face, that even fathers, even legends, are not immortal. One night, after finishing another haunting tune at the piano, Elvis kissed her forehead and whispered, "You remember what I always tell you, darling? Hold on to respect. Don't let the world tell you who you are. Promise me you'll remember." She promised. And though she smiled, though she tried to act as though nothing felt different, inside she carried a quiet dread. Because for the first time, Lisa Marie Presley felt the passing of time not as a distant idea, but as a shadow in the room, a presence lingering just beyond her reach. And she began to understand that every word her father spoke to her now was more than comfort. It was preparation. The summer of 1977 pressed down heavy on Memphis. The air seemed thicker, the light harsher, as though the world itself carried a weight that no one wanted to name aloud. Lisa Marie was 9, still young enough to be a child, but old enough now to sense the unease around her father. The adults spoke in careful tones, their eyes avoiding hers whenever the subject of his health came close. For Lisa, time with him felt more precious than ever. Each evening she sought him out, whether he was at the piano, resting in his room, or simply sitting on the porch, watching the sky turn gold. She was afraid, though she couldn't explain why. Afraid that moments were slipping through her fingers like sand. One night, not long before his final tour, she found him in his favorite chair, the television flickering soundlessly in the background. He looked tired, his face drawn, but his smile was still there when he saw her. She climbed onto the arm of the chair, leaning against him the way she always had. For a while they sat in silence, the hum of cicadas drifting through the open window. Then, with a sudden courage she didn't expect, Lisa asked the question that had been building inside her. "Daddy, what if I fall in love again one day? How will I know if it's real?" Elvis turned off the television with a click, the room falling into quiet. He studied her face, his expression thoughtful. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached for her hand, holding it gently between his. His palms were warm, rough from years of guitars and microphones, yet his grip was tender. "When it's right," he said finally, "you'll know, because of the way he looks at you. It won't be about who you are to the world, or who your daddy is, or what you've got. It'll be about you. And when you feel like you're the only one in the room, like you matter above everything else, that's how you'll know." Lisa's eyes widened, her heart beating fast. She listened with all the intensity a child could muster, absorbing every syllable. "But remember something, baby," he continued, his voice steady but tinged with gravity. "Don't ever let anybody else's voice drown out your own. Not your friends, not strangers, not even mine. You've got to listen to your heart first. That's the only compass that'll never lie to you." The words startled her. For the first time, he wasn't asking her to trust his judgment, wasn't placing himself as the final authority. He was giving her permission to stand on her own, to believe in herself even above his counsel. It was the most liberating and the most frightening lesson he had ever offered. Lisa felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but she didn't want to cry. She wanted to memorize this moment exactly as it was. Her father's hand wrapped around hers, his voice soft but certain, the air heavy with something unspoken. She whispered, "I promise, Daddy." Elvis smiled, a faint curve of his lips, and kissed the top of her head. "That's all I ask." The weeks that followed blurred together, shows, rehearsals, fleeting moments of quiet. Lisa remembered flashes, the sparkle of his stage suits, the sound of his laughter over late-night snacks, the way his eyes lingered on her as though trying to etch her face into memory. She didn't yet understand that he was leaving her pieces of himself in every look, every word. And then, too soon, he was gone. The world mourned loudly. Crowds at the gates of Graceland, headlines screaming across the globe, strangers weeping as though they had lost a family member. For Lisa, the grief was quieter, sharper. She hadn't just lost a legend. She had lost her father, the one person who had turned every fear into a lesson, every heartbreak into a kind of strength. Yet in the silence that followed, his words remained. They lived in her like a secret melody. Respect is everything. You belong to yourself. Listen to your heart, even above mine. She carried them into adolescence, into womanhood, into every relationship that tested her. And no matter how chaotic life became, no matter how heavy the Presley name weighed on her shoulders, those words were there, steady as a compass, guiding her through. Years later, when Lisa thought back to that summer evening, the flickering television, the hum of cicadas, her father's hand warm around hers, she understood that this was his last and greatest gift. Not fame, not fortune, not even the music that would outlive him. It was the permission to trust herself. And though the world remembered Elvis Presley as a king, Lisa remembered him as a father who, in his final lesson, gave his daughter the crown of her own voice.